Short presentation. If you have any questions or discussion, we'll do this after the fact. But Tim,
All right.
I feel like I've known him for years because I've read so much that he's written.
Well, thanks. It's more pleasure than I can tell you to be here for because of a couple of past experiences I have had. Back in, it must have been around the middle of the 1980s, so about 30 years ago, I had the first formal interview with a couple of the founders of Drop City. I was quite interested in the whole thing. I wrote it up. I'm an academic trying to make a career, right? So I wrote it up into a nice, fairly formal article, and I sent it off to your Colorado State Historical Journal. And I got a really snotty letter back saying, "We deal in serious history. We don't deal in fringe weirdos." Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but the letter was not amusing. And so I thought, well, okay, and I actually published it somewhere else, but that was my first reception from this state for that. Then later, probably in the 90s, I stopped by a tourist information booth here in Trinidad and asked the woman who was there about Drop City. I actually knew where it was, but I just asked her, "Do you know where Drop City was?" And she did, and she described it correctly, how to get there. And then I asked her, "Does anyone ever ask about Drop City here? Is it remembered at all?" And she kind of paused a minute, and she said, "No." So I feel like, hey, we've come a long ways. This many people interested. So what I'm going to do tonight, if I keep it fairly informal, I hope, and try not to go on forever because I'd like to have some discussion. But what I want to do is set Drop City in context. I want to look at some of America's communal history. They didn't invent the idea of communal living. They didn't invent the idea of the art colony, anything like that. There's a long history of that before them. So what I want to do is look at some of the past setting that I think is important for understanding them, because they didn't come out of nowhere. And then I also want to look at what happened. I think they were a pivot between an older and a newer generation, and look at what their influence did later on. And I think that influence is still going on today in communal life in America. So it's going to be some early, some Drop City, and some later, okay? So beginning with Plymouth Colony. This goes back early, right? In 1620, when the Pilgrims settled the early Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, in their charter was a requirement that they follow what was called the common course and cause. And that was, they were backed by a bunch of merchants in London. That's how they got their money to come here. And the requirement that they had was they had to live communally and share all resources. They had a totally money-pooled existence there. And that went on for a couple of years, and eventually they got enough prosperity they could cut those ties with England, and they decommunalized. But to my mind, that's the first, since the beginning of British settlement, I think that's really where the story begins. A lot of histories of American communitarianism go a little farther forward to the 1660s and identify what is often called Plockhoy's Commonwealth. Plockhoy was Dutch and had a vision, and he laid it out. This wasn't a good requirement put on by his backers. He laid out a plan by which he would establish a communal colony in what is now Delaware. And if you go to the little seaside town of Lewis, Delaware, they still have a memorial to him in their museum. But he put together a manifesto for what communal living would be like, what a communal economy would be like. Quite a detailed prospectus. So that's kind of, to my mind, where it all begins. So to go forward, just to make a definition, there's a lot of debate about just what an intentional community is, but for me, this is what it is. And so the groups I'm looking at will fit this definition. You have to be there for a purpose. you don't, it's not just accidental, it's not just college roommates or something. It's, you have to be there pursuing some kind of ideal, very often religious, sometimes social. Today, a lot of times the ideal is environmental, but some kind of purpose that holds people together. You'd have to live together in my definition. We use the word community in all kinds of ways, but groups that I look at, people are living either in the same building or in adjacent buildings. Somehow you're really living together. Some economic sharing. Today it's not very popular to share everything. There are some groups that still have a totally communal economy, but most do not. Most have a mixed economy, some communal, some private. And finally, critical mass, a certain number of people. That is to say, it's not just two people with high ideals. What is that threshold? In the world of communal studies, and I'm not the only one who does it, the typical threshold is 5, although some would say more like 20 or 25, but 5 is kind of the consensus minimum. That is people who are not related, 5 different people. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. Another one in colonial days, some people point to this as the earliest example. It's not exactly, but it's early. Johannes Kelpius. There was a group that started out from Europe, Germans mainly, and came here to settle. They were religious seekers. They were Christians, but they were also Rosicrucians, they were mystics, and they really expected the second coming of Christ, and they thought they could figure out when that would happen. So they settled in what was then outside of Philadelphia. Today it's actually within the city of Philadelphia in Fairmount Park. But they settled there, built a number of hermitages to live in. There were 40 of them, and they built this tabernacle, and they put a little, what would you say, a little lookout on the roof, and that was where they went up. They had a telescope, and they scanned the skies for signs of the second coming.
Wow.
Anyway, that lasted for quite a few years. This cave is there in Fairmount Park today, and the sign there says this is the cave of Kelpius himself, where he lived as a hermit. We don't know that that's true, but anyway, nice story. Might be, could be. Ephrata in Pennsylvania, 1730s. That's out in Lancaster County, about 50, 60 miles west of Philadelphia. This is significant because it was fairly large and long-lived, and it's also the oldest intentional community in America of which we have built remains. These buildings are original. They've been rehabbed some, but they're original. So this goes back, well over 300 years, well, about 300 years now. Their meeting hall is still there in original form pretty much. They were calligraphers. They did beautiful handwritten manuscripts. They were musicians, and also millennial, also strongly looking for the second coming of Christ, and that's why they lived communally. They're really like a monastic order, though they were Protestants. They were Seventh-day Brethren, worshipped on Saturday. The group that's probably the first one that very many people have heard of in America, these early ones I think are not widely known, the Shakers, who were brought to America by Ann Lee, of whom this is not a real picture. There are no surviving images of her, but someone put this together a long time ago as a psychographic image. That is, I'm psychically channeling Ann Lee, and this is what she looked like. So that's the best we have. They went on to build some close to 20 communities, several hundred people each around the country, 5,000 people or so at their peak around 1840. Beautiful, beautiful architecture. Known for a number of things such as strict separation of the sexes, a staunchly celibate community. Those 2 doors, one for men, one for women, at the Pleasant Hill Village in Kentucky, still very much there. Very nice museum village today. Those 2 doors go right into the same hallway. There's no separation except you got to keep men and women moving in separate ways. They were known for, in their early years up until the mid-19th century, for their enthusiastic worship, what they called laboring, this intensive dancing. We just have a few pictures of that have come down. Of course, very well known for their furniture style. Shaker furniture today, still a very popular style. A simple chair like this, if you were to buy an original, and there are lots of them around, they made a lot of them. If you were to go to an auction and buy one today, you could expect to pay at least $5,000 for it. One of their very nice large wardrobes was sold at auction a few years ago to a major shaker collector by the name of Oprah Winfrey. She's a major shaker collector. She paid $238,000 for a wardrobe. That's what shaker furniture is like. Leading one of the last surviving eldresses to say, "I don't want to be remembered as a chair." But that's the way they did it. Everything very neat. You're not using a chair, hang it up. Oh, it's just going to collect dust if you leave it on the floor. Another shaker invention there. The broom on the left was the standard American broom till the shakers came along. They got the idea that if you flattened it out, it'd be more efficient. You ever see a round broom these days? Yeah, flat brooms, much better. Well, that's shakers, you can thank for that. Great architecture. This barn at Hancock in Massachusetts, I think is just a gem of a piece of architecture. And even more practical than you can see, it's set into a hillside, so they could bring the hay in at the upper level and then pitch it down to the cattle on the lower level and not have to do like so many farmers do and lift the hay up into the hayloft. Large herbal business, wide-ranging. At one time, they were the largest opium producers in the United States. Remember, that used to be legal. There are 3 of them left today, 3 confirmed members and 1 novice member. They may get a new member one of these days. Young man is considering it, and he's living with them. Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. This is it. This is the last respite of the Shakers. Hutterites. In terms of overall longevity, Shakers have been in the U.S. for almost 250 years now. They came in the 1770s. The Hutterites are longer overall, but not as long in the U.S. They came in the 1870s. They go back to 1528 in Europe, out of the Anabaptist uprising in the 1520s, in Switzerland particularly. All the Anabaptists were ferociously persecuted by both Catholics and Protestants. They had incredibly radical ideas like separation of church and state, and well, of course, they're known to be pacifists and things like that, a number of things. But the Hutterites were distinctive for a communal economy, and to this day, they live in colonies. This is a recent map of where they are. So some in the upper United States and the plains parts of the United States, about 2/3 of them in Canada. Why so many in Canada? They settled in South Dakota here when they came in 1874. They stayed until World War I. World War I, a time of terrible persecution of German-speaking people. The Hutterites were German-speaking, and they basically were pressured out. In fact, 2 of their members were arrested for refusing military service, taken to military prison at Fort Leavenworth, and were tortured to death. So with that, they left the U.S. and went almost entirely to Canada. Only in the 1930s to come back. South Dakota begged them to come back because they needed good farmers during the Depression. So they're mixed today, some in the U.S., some in Canada, but still living a totally communal economy, and they're thriving. They're doing very well. So this is what a colony looks like. Typically around 100 people live there, and they farm. They typically have about 6,000 acres. They're very good farmers. Still wear their old traditional costumes that go back to 16th century Europe. There's some young people, and you go to a Hutterite colony, that's what you'll see. Another group that was communal a little bit afterwards, another important group in American history, the Mormons. They're not mainly known for that today, but Joseph Smith, the founder, said that they ought to live communally. He didn't do much about it in his lifetime. They played with it a little. Didn't get really serious, but when Brigham Young came along, when they went to Utah in the late 1840s, well, it took a while, but eventually he declared that that's really what they ought to do, and they founded dozens of communal settlements, mainly in Utah, some in Arizona, some in Idaho, some in surrounding areas. So polygamy, of course, was a standard part of Mormonism up until early 20th century, and Brigham Young and his, we don't know, no one knows, 40 or 50 wives lived, I guess you could say, communally in a household themselves. But there were many places, notably this one in southern Utah, Orderville, named after the communal system, which was called the United Order. But a totally communal economy. They were farmers. They irrigated and farmed there in southern Utah. After the death of Joseph Smith, the founder, in 1844, the Mormons splintered, and James Strang led one of the notable factions. Had history been a little bit different, that might have been the dominant faction. But he ended up taking his flock up to Beaver Island. You can see in the lower right corner where it is, up in Upper Lake Michigan. And they had a thriving community there for quite a few years. They were also polygamists. And it all lasted until Strang was shot by a disaffected relative of one of his followers. End of that. Is it still going on today? Yeah, quite a few of the splinter Mormon groups are still communal. This is the Brotherhood of Christ, lives not far from us, and we live in Lawrence, Kansas. This is about 140 miles from us in southern Iowa. They are more Amish than the Amish. They really reject technology. They are building these houses by hand, no power tools, putting on thatched roofs on some of them. Beautiful, it's great stuff. This is one under construction, but it's wonderful stuff. They're really dedicatedly living a totally communal life today. I think there are 50 or 60 of them there. This is how they get their power. An old-fashioned horsepower. Walk a horse around in a circle, there's your power takeoff, and that's how you run your equipment. No electricity, not even compressed air for power like the Amish use. A very notable group in the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints in Colorado City, Arizona, plus some satellite colonies. Just use this as an illustration of one man and his family. You can see Leroy Johnson standing there kind of in the middle with his 5 wives in front, and then his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Those are his progeny. That's what polygamy and no birth control can do for you. When I went to Colorado City, one of the things that really amazed me is how there are these gigantic houses, and then you look at what's going on and you see why. Just a quick note on Colorado and what's happened here. There have been a number of communities, intentional communities in Colorado. This is the Dutch colony that was active out around Alamosa in the late 19th century. 1892 it's dated. A very unfortunate case of it. They didn't last very long. They were swindled. A guy sold them land on which they were going to build their colony. It turned out it was a fraud, and they lost everything basically in the swindle. And then on top of that, they had an epidemic that swept through them. They lost a lot of people to diphtheria and typhoid and things, very terrible diseases. So short-lived, but there was a colony that had, they not had such reverses, might have really amounted to something. The Colorado Cooperative Company, this building, I took this picture recently, last few years, out in Nucla, Colorado. These people were basically decided to start a new village, and to do it out there, it's dry country, of course, they had to irrigate. And so their common project they united on was an irrigation ditch and a flume. There's still remnants of it out there. You can go look at it today, and it's really amazing the effort they put into it. Spent years building this incredible irrigation system. And then once they got it done, they all divided their land up into private plots and gave up the communal part of it. At least they had their water. So that building was, last time I was there, still there. Fort Amity, out in eastern Colorado, near Holly. Salvation Army, around the turn of the century, built 3 colonies. The whole idea was to take poor urban people and take them back to the land and set them up as communal farmers. Fort Amity lasted for several years. There's nothing left of it except a cemetery where some of them are buried. But it did well for a while. One of the worst things that happened to them was they had bad water for irrigation, very salty water relatively. You know how I think anyone who lives in irrigation country knows salt's a problem with irrigation. The deposits cause trouble. That's what happened to them. Their land fairly soon got too salty, and that all didn't work forever. Have you ever heard of the emissary communities? They're here in Colorado today, doing perfectly well. They're up at Loveland, up near Fort Collins. A religious community. They have kind of a new age religion. One of their central practices is attunement. To my mind, it looks kind of like chiropractic, but except there's no touching. You get the person's energy fields in line, and that makes you well. And if I have good energy tonight, that's because when I was up there, they attuned me. So we'll see, I guess. Greeley, the town of Greeley, some of you probably seen the name. Well, partly it was this whole rush to colonize this part of the country, 1870s, 80s. And Nathan Meeker had the backing of Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, very influential in his day. So he gathered a bunch of people together, and among other things, the colony was dedicated to temperance. It absolutely outlawed all alcohol. For many years that prevailed. Though I see from a recent tourist brochure I picked up that Greeley's got a couple of brew pubs now. Nathan Meeker would not have approved. Cotopaxi, some of you know Cotopaxi probably. That was settled as an intentional community, Jewish community. Great wave of Jewish immigration in the 1880s, very early 1880s. And the settled American Jews went to a lot of trouble and expense to help them settle in rural places as farmers, collective farmers, colonies, communal economies in most cases. But that's how Cotopaxi was settled. Basically, they only lasted a year or two. They couldn't take the winter up there. It just was not the kind of thing they were used to, and they just struggled and couldn't make it. So they abandoned it. But of course, there's a little bit of a village there now. And if you go out in the cemetery at Cotopaxi, you'll see some of the gravestones have Hebrew on them. Still remnants of that. Getting into the art colonies, which I think are a direct antecedent of Drop City. Albert Hubbard started one of the first, kind of a showman of communal life. In the 1890s, he got going with the Roykoff community in New York State. He was quite a publicist. He had magazines and books that he published. This was the most popular of all of his publications, this inspirational writing telling you how to do your best in the face of adversity. They did a lot of artwork. This is the arts and crafts era. It's a very beautiful artwork. A lot of glass work, pottery. Anyway, that's the Roycroft. They had quite a few people there. The campus is still there. Albert Hubbard went down with the Lusitania in 1915, and that kind of was the end of that colony. But there still are artists working there. It still is a working community of sorts, not communal economy anymore, though. Rose Valley in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. They took over a couple of old mill buildings, and one of them became later, and still is today, the town hall of the little suburb of Rose Valley. But it was an arts and crafts community, quite collective in its economy, and these great big mill buildings, all kinds of artists that worked and produced, again, the arts and crafts era, the furniture and decorative arts that were characteristic of that time. And if you go through Rose Valley today, some beautiful architecture there. These were real artists that lived there. It's one of their gathering places, community building. New York State, about the same time, Birdcliff Colony. Quite a few of those buildings are still there. Birdcliff was the brainchild of this man, an Englishman, Ralph Radcliffe Whitehead. And he was wealthy, and he simply financed the whole thing, went out and bought land, paid to have buildings built, and told artists basically they could come and live there, and it was not so much common money as it was his money. And people lived there and produced terrific artwork. It was a beautiful place for quite a few years. Lots of these traditional buildings. Built a lot of good arts and crafts furniture. And that was their downfall, actually. They picked the wrong industry. Arts and crafts furniture is big, stout, heavy stuff. And to get it to market in New York City would be the logical market for them. You had to get it there on the railroad. Well, they were far from the railroad, so they had to load it into a wagon and get it there. Very expensive to ship, and that really was the finances of it did them in. Whitehead got tired of paying all this money and not being able to get stuff to market, so eventually it kind of went its way. But Woodstock today remains an artist colony, and the Droppers, when they started Drop City, knew a good chunk of this history. They knew that was back there. I don't know if they knew about Quarry Hill. That's in Vermont, still going today. 1950s, 40s and 50s it got started. People bought land and again opened it up. And there's a great strain of cooperation there, although the economy is not totally communal, it's mixed. But people come and build their own houses and live there. And they're doing fine. Arcos Santi in the Arizona desert north of Phoenix, an Italian, Paolo Soleri, had this new concept of making self-sustaining cities in the desert. And he had distinctive architectural ideas about what would work well in a desert climate. So this is some of the building that's been done out there. Pretty unusual stuff. He just died quite recently, but they're still going. This is his plan for the whole thing. Several thousand people living kind of mostly under domes because this is going to be the way that you can grow food out in this hostile environment. What you see in those earlier pictures is just a little bit right here. I mean, this is a massive concept. They're not very far along. Soleri always refused government money, so without that, I don't know, it's hard. But they're working on it. The Merry Pranksters in late 50s into the early 60s. Ken Kesey, who got involved in some early LSD experiments. You know, the early LSD experiments were conducted by the Army and the CIA and FBI, people like that who thought this might have uses for their programs. Ken Kesey volunteered and became the committed acid head and really helped shape what was to come. We're getting now down to the time at Drop City. Things are beginning to change in the culture. But some of you may have read the Electric Kool-Aid acid Test, Tom Wolfe's book, which is the chronicle of the Merry Pranksters driving their bus across the country. And quite a trip it was. Anyway, there's something new going on in the culture at this point, and the droppers were aware of what was going on. Did they live communally? They did for a while. Merry Pranksters did. This little place at La Honda, a lot of people camped out in the woods around the house, and it was a very lively and chaotic scene for a couple of years until Kesey got tired of it and kicked them all out and moved to Oregon. Millbrook, another one about the same time as the Merry Pranksters. Ralph Metzner there on the left, and Timothy Leary, also early LSD explorers. Very different. The pranksters were out to have a really good time. And these guys were quite religious, actually. They were very serious about using this for spiritual insight. So some heirs to the Mellon fortune who owned this massive mansion, 64-room mansion with thousands of acres of grounds, let them have it for several years to conduct their psychedelic experiences. And again, this is something that was widely reported. I think, had some influence on the droppers. Droppers had open land. People could just come at will. Well, one of the first places that happened was here at Gorda. If you drive Highway 1, the California Coast Highway, through the Big Sur area, you go through this crossroads. It's nothing much, just a tiny place at Gorda. But a woman owned a bunch of land there and simply opened it up. And starting in 1962, 63, it became kind of, this is before hippie days, but it's proto-hippie, it's beatnik times. So the thing is shaping up. This is all, to my mind, what comes to full fruition in Drop City. Tolstoy Farm, another one in New York State. And fellow his family owned quite a bit of land. They gave him a couple hundred acres. He opened it up again, open land. Just come, live here, build your own house, do what you want to do. No rules. One rule for Tolstoy Farm, that is that no one can be asked to leave, which caused them a certain amount of trouble. Anyway, still very much there today. People still living there. So that's got a year or so on Drop City. There's Piper Williams, the founder. So anyway, all kinds of houses were built there. Some of them are pretty nice, some of them not so much. But they're getting along just fine. The concrete school they built with a concrete roof. I don't know if the droppers knew about that when they started building domes, but it was there. Wavy Gravy, who was maybe best known early for his group's presence at the Woodstock Festival, known as Hugh Romney in those days. He didn't become Wavy Gravy until a little bit later. But they also had a bus, something like the Kesey bus, and they are still going. The hog farm is alive and well in California. They have an urban base in Berkeley, and they have a farm about 4 or 5 hours north of the city up in northern Mendocino County. And they're quite thriving. I just read the other day, Wavy just had his 79th birthday. So one of the things they did in later years was they ran nobody for president. And then when we had that contest where I remember for several days our election a few years ago was unsettled, this is what they came up with for a sign. Their candidate won, nobody won. Anyway, they still run their rural place, both places, and he supports himself with a summer camp teaching children how to be clowns, Camp Winter Rainbow. So, and there's 1 week every summer, it's reserved for adults, so if you want to be a clown, you can go learn from Wavy. So, getting down from these early experiments to Drop City, and this is the famous complex that maybe some of you got to see while it was here. This is Gene Bernofsky, a recent picture of Gene, who has continued taking pictures, making movies. He did that at Drop City, still doing it today. Become quite an environmental activist in recent years. There he is at Drop City. This is his wife, Joanne Bernofsky. They're still together, and this is Joanne at their home in Montana, where they've lived for 30 years or so now. And there is Joanne at Drop City with their daughter May, who was born in 1966 while they were living there. So we still see May now and then because she happens to live where we do in Lawrence, Kansas. Clark Rickard, the third founder, was there, and this is a recent picture of him. He has started out from his art that came from the droppers to his own artwork, and he teaches art, produces art, and has been doing it basically all of his life. Here's an earlier picture of him at one of the domes at Drop City with another dropper, Carol DeGiulio, who just died a few weeks ago, sadly. So these are the people. What are the influences that led to Drop City? One, I do believe, was the Reds. Gene and Joanne both grew up in communist households. Their parents were both active party members, and getting the party line was important. Are they still Marxists? Are they still communists today? I don't think I would call them that, but they're definitely left of center, for sure. But this is kind of where a lot of it comes from, I think. Clark were all art students at KU, and they lived in a loft on Massachusetts Street, the main drag, and they started making art that had to do with living on Massachusetts Street. This is one of their early projects. Gene took pictures from day one, so luckily we have quite a few of them. They just hung this shoe out from the roof of the building and then watched people's expressions as they walked by. That was their interest, was watching how people reacted. In 1962, that was pretty avant-garde for that time period. Here's another piece of drop art from Lawrence, the breakfast on the sidewalk. Set that up right in front of the classiest hotel in town, and they just watched people's reactions as they walked by it. So that was early. Richard Colway there on the left was, he joined the Droppers very early, so you could say he was almost a fourth founder, but he's there in a recent picture with Clark. And together they bought their 6 acres of goat pasture out on the El Moro Road and began building things. Although they didn't have any idea what they were doing, and some of their early building is, to hear them describe it, is just incredible. How do you hold things together? They took used bottle caps, pounded them out flat, punched a bunch of holes in them, and then wired them together so that they would press in and hold a joint together. I mean, this is a very labor-intensive way to join 2 pieces of metal or something. That's what they really had no experience, no background. But as they said, and they've repeated, they still will tell you today, they were going to build a new civilization. We're getting rid of all this stuff here, and we're going our own way. And boy, did they ever. So initially, buildings like this, just whatever scrap materials they could find. They eventually came up with ideas about how to make things. It changed quite a bit when this fellow, fairly early in the game, showed up, Steve Bear. Steve Bear was really something of a visionary architect, I would say. He spent his whole career doing innovative work, a lot of things in alternative energy, but also in construction. But he conceptualized domes in a way that the droppers never did. They had much better ideas about how to build them. There he is more recently. He calls his design zones, and they have an interesting advantage of not necessarily just being perfect domes, but you can, by using the form, you can stretch them and they make different shapes, and it becomes very interesting, some of the things he designed. There's his wife Holly, who was there early on helping with him, and still his partner in progress today. So this is with Steve Bear's influence, the architecture at Drop City changed. Notice these little pieces of wood here joined together, clamped together. Well, they discovered that a lumber mill in the area was throwing away or selling for virtually nothing mill ends, they called them, short pieces of lumber. Because, you know, lumber comes in even increments, so there's always stuff left over. And they could get those for nothing or very little, and then they clamp them together and make a longer piece out of it. And by doing that, again, very labor intensive, but they had a lot of time, they weren't working. They put it all together and made some pretty amazing domes. So this is what the structure looked like, the framework. And then just all sorts of different things. Some construction out of railroad ties, because the railroads throw away a lot of ties, so they could go gather those up and then put a dome on top of that. So lots of domes. That's Steve Bear's influence, a dome basically, but with a stretched design. Is that Peter's dome? I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, Peter Rabbit's dome. The theater dome, this is a late picture after Drop City was abandoned, and when I began to visit and look there at the place, this is one of the few structures left standing, because it really was not well enough built to endure without a lot of upkeep. The kitchen dome. And back to the complex again, the biggest thing they built. People inside there having a meal. A zone in the winter. So, pretty amazing architecture out there. And I asked Gene once, weren't your neighbors outraged? Neighbors don't usually like weird things going on. Weren't they really unhappy with you? And Gene's answer, some of you might know better than I do, but Gene's answer was no. He thought they were eccentric, but we were kind of interesting. So he said that wasn't really a big problem. And so much so that the fellow who ran the Dairy Joy offered them some free ice cream if he'd let them put up the sign, because they did attract quite a lot of tourists with their strange architecture. But eventually things changed. The tourists kind of overwhelmed them and things went on differently. This is one of the few pictures that tries to capture what it looked like on their little 6 acres of land. There's another one. That's about at the peak of it, I'd say. Anyway, lots of art. Art out of just found materials of all kinds. So lots of things. They were very, very proud of the comic book they invented, the being bag. Which was made by hand with silk screens. Again, labor-intensive process.
Cool.
But Gene Bernofsky wrote the content, and Clark Rickert drew the pictures, and they proudly sold subscriptions. They didn't sell very many. And the being bag went out of existence after one issue. If you want to buy one today, they're for sale in the collector's market. you can count on them being in the thousands of dollars.
Wow.
So if you'd only known that then and invested, right? The ultimate painting, this elaborate painting that they all worked on, and they hooked it up to a strobe light, spun it, and by all accounts, a really spectacular, amazing thing to see. But someone borrowed it and took it to show someone on the East Coast, and it disappeared, so don't have that anymore. There's that sign. Peter Rabbit, not one of the founders, although read some of the accounts, they say he is, that's wrong. But he came and joined them later on. Here he is in the 90s, living in Taos. He came in, and one of the things he did was he announced we would have the Joy Festival in the summer of '67. So that's high hippie days, and he wanted to participate. But other people didn't think it was such a good thing to do. People left eventually, the founders left, other people left. There were several ups and downs through history. In the latter years, it got fairly grim. But again, by the time we were visiting, this is about most of what was left. This is a recent picture of the site. So, I need the second set here. This set. Later, okay, we had the earlier part, now the later. Libre, which is up west of Walsenburg, near the little town of Gardner. Libre was influenced definitely by Drop City. Dean Fleming and his wife Linda Fleming and Peter Rabbit, whom you just saw, went together up there. They were given some land. There was a rich hippie who bought the land for them and started building, again, idiosyncratic structures of their own. This is how it started, with a dome. This is still the dome that is Dean's home and art studio today. Jim Fowler built a rather eccentric house. When I first went, Dean wrote me and told me, gave me directions and said, when you see an obvious hippie structure, you'll know you're there. This was it. Some very beautiful architecture, I think. Bill Haynes, who's a lamp maker, did this. Anyway, a real community of artists. Dean expanded his over the years to have a bedroom dome, a small bedroom dome, and then art studio domes. Still there working. His lady friend, Sibylla Wallenborn, has her own house there, various structures, mainly built of discarded railroad ties, but again, a dome on top. There, Dean and Sibylla in the 90s. Another house, why that round, that oval window up there? Well, this fella came across that piece of glass and then built the structure to fit it, because it was such a nice thing to have. And that's the way it was done. Very, very little expense in all these things. Also little attention sometimes to creature comfort. This is the outhouse for that house in the last slide. And Libre is at 9,000 feet. You know, can you imagine having to go to the outhouse in the middle of the night in the winter when it's open like this? That's still functional as far as I know. That's Dean's outhouse. Put a nice picture window in it so you can sit there and look out at the Sangre de Cristos. Some houses more modern. One of the members built this one up on a hilltop. Someone wanted a two-story house with a view, so that's how you do it. Two rooms on top of each other. Linda and Dean split up many years ago, and Linda later came back and built her own house with her new partner, Michael. There. They still spend their summers there, although she is now the dean of an art school in California, so her title is Dean Fleming. Dean's still painting. It's one of his early paintings. Some of this early abstract geometrical art is in major museums, including our big museum in our part of the country, the Nelson Museum in Kansas City. Anyway, lots of art scattered around the property. Quite an artist community. New Mexico also followed Drop City, and more in New Mexico than in Colorado, I think, more activity. This is a recent map someone tried to put together in New Mexico's history. This author found 51 communities starting in the 1880s that have been here. Placitas in northern New Mexico had something very definitely inspired by Drop City. The Lower Farm was inspired by it. Ulysses S. Grant, as he called himself, ran for president in 1968, I think it was. Later committed a double murder and was eventually killed in a building fire. Interesting story. Lama Foundation down north of Taos. This is in their early days building a dome for their spiritual purposes. This is the fellow originally known as Steve Durkee. He left Lama because it was too loose. He wanted a stricter spiritual environment. Became a Muslim Sufi and is now Noureddin. But the dome remains a major gathering point for Libre, where they do Sufi dancing and, of course, meditation, things like that. Much of it in the early years under the leadership of Sam Lewis. Oh, everyone called him Sufi Sam. He's buried there. Ram Dass came fairly early, became a major participant, supporter. Among other things, he and some other Lama beings, as they call themselves, wrote this book, Be Here Now. Spectacular bestseller. They made a ton of money off of it. In fact, it's what floated Lama for many years. New Buffalo, some of you know New Buffalo probably. But buildings out of adobe. How traditional is that? New Buffalo, they were trying to go back to traditional ways. In fact, that's what the name meant. The New Buffalo commune is going to be what the buffalo was to the Indians. It's going to be everything to us. So they built a number of adobe buildings there. This is a later picture of the main building at New Buffalo. Too many people for the buildings, so some lived in teepees. Still there, although under different circumstances. There they are, mixing mud and making adobe. Lots of gardening in that hard climate down there. So, anyway, a real commune for quite a few years. They're making jewelry to sell at the local market. Eventually it collapsed communally. Much later, a fellow named Bob Thies bought it and tried to restore it, and he put a lot of money and effort into bringing it back. He wanted it just like it was. Did a really nice job with it. So that's what it looks like today. Bob, unfortunately, has had both financial reversals and some health problems. And last I knew, which was not very long ago, it was for sale. So you want to buy a historic hippie commune, I think you could. Another one just a few miles away, Morning Star. There's been a Morning Star in California that was hassled by the authorities for they didn't follow the zoning code for openers. Anyway, they found a nice landlord in New Mexico who let them settle and build for free. So they lived there for a few years. Again, building with adobe. There's one of the members, Pam Reed, with her children. She lived in the original Morning Star but moved out here. Very nearby, Reality Construction Company, a commune of hardline leftists. One up north of Taos called Lorien. And Lorien had its problems, but it's kind of a second generation came to be known as Lila, Lorien Institute of Life Arts. A bunch of communities have come along the last couple of decades at the Baca at Crestone, where land has been given to religious communities of all kinds. And has spread, of course, far beyond Colorado, New Mexico. This commune called the Family of the Mystic Arts was in southern Oregon, managed to end up in the cover of Life magazine. And as you can imagine, we're inundated with visitors. Packer Corners in Vermont. Raymond Mungo, who wrote eloquently about hippie communal life. I still think one of the most evocative works on it. The Lost Farm, actually out of order. This is out of order too, sorry. Back to Drop City. Any of you ever seen this book? Well, it is a complete lie. And And it's insulting to real people. It's not about Drop City, it's really about Morningstar Ranch in California. And it insults the people who are there in a way that's just very unfortunate. The names are changed just slightly, but they're very recognizable names, and they are not accurate depictions of those people. I mean, why he couldn't think up different names, that's all it would have taken. It would be probably a fairly interesting novel, but I find it really offensive. Both the people who built the real Drop City and the people from the real Morningstar Ranch are deeply offended by this book, I can tell you that. Lou Gottlieb, who was a member of the Limelighters folk trio. They made a lot of money mainly from a big Coca-Cola commercial. And so he bought land that he opened up and people settled there. He got very committed to open land, no one will be kicked out, and it became a magnet. It was just 50 miles north of San Francisco. So during the summer of love, people came pouring out. They could build whatever they want, live there however they wanted, no restrictions. Pam Reed, who you saw a minute ago with her children at Morningstar, New Mexico, was there at the original Morningstar. She said, this picture's from Time Magazine. She told me that her father took Time Magazine, and when his daughter appeared in the picture in it, he wanted to tell all of his friends, but he said he couldn't bring himself to do it under these conditions. Ramon, who is the longest resident of Morningstar, still very much the leader of the scattered flock today. Lou Gottlieb again with Bill Wheeler. Once the county finally came in with bulldozers, and they really bulldozed Morningstar flat out to the ground. And Bill Wheeler, who owned land nearby, opened his up, and a bunch of them moved over there. And once again, they could build their own houses, live as they wanted. This book was a hippie bestseller, Living on the Earth, Alicia Bay Laurel, written at Wheeler's. This is all about how to live on the land, how to live on nothing. Poly Ranch, which was nearby, great old mansion that was rented out by a man with a lot of money, and a group that called themselves the Chosen Family lived there and had a series of misadventures that finally brought that to an end. Black Bear Ranch in remote Northern California, very remote place, set up to be a revolutionary training ground, because you know the revolution is coming. But they were also inundated by newcomers that never amounted to that. But they did pitch in and build a bunch of buildings. That's still going today too. It was originally a mining camp, but once the mines played out, they could buy it pretty cheaply. Carista had one of the largest group marriages in history. 20 or so people involved in it, and they actually had a sleeping schedule. You actually were assigned a partner. You know, you go around the circle of the diagram and different partner every night. Very, very dedicated to free love. As far as they were concerned, it was heaven on earth. They lasted for quite a few years. They had a very successful computer business. Financially were prosperous. Farm in Tennessee, the biggest of all of the hippie communes. Stephen Gaskin, who got started as a spiritual teacher in San Francisco. His wife, Ina May, who became a wonderful expert midwife. Stephen preached to these large crowds every Sunday morning at the farm. This is where he started out, Monday nights in San Francisco. But they built a farm with an incredible offer, I think. Stephen was against abortion, very strongly against abortion. But instead of just saying, let's outlaw abortion, he said, if you're pregnant and don't know what to do, you come here and we'll deliver your baby for free. And if you want to take your baby and leave, you can. And if you want to stay here with your baby, you can. And if you want to leave your baby, you can. And if you want to come back and get your baby later, you can. Free, no charge. I mean, what kind of offer is that? I mean, that is hard to think of something more generous, I think. That's what Ida May pioneered. All these groups of hippies out working, gardening together very successfully. Lots of weddings. After the Sunday service, you could get up and Stephen would marry you. Today, a major eco-village center trying to show ways to live in a more earth-friendly way. They're building some buildings out of dirt bags. These are simply sturdy bags, flexible bags that are filled with dirt and piled up, and that's the building. Pretty economical building. Twin Oaks in Virginia, that's the Twin Oaks. Started from scratch on an old tobacco farm. built a, what am I doing? Going the wrong way. And they developed a reasonably successful industry making hammocks. And they sold them for many years through Pier 1 stores, although I think that contract's canceled. They still make hammocks though. Their heat storage in one of their buildings was cans of water collect heat by day and then let it out at night. Commie Clothes, you need clothes, they have a free clothing store. Children of God, a religious commune proclaiming the end of the world. Also ended up, strangely enough, going from being these very conservative Christians to basically a free love group, because God's law is love after all. 12 tribes very much alive and well today, but they go back to the 70s. One of their things is women need to submit to their husbands. So they're showing it at the wedding. They do lots of dancing, kind of Israeli style dancing it seems to me. Support themselves mainly with restaurants, many of them called Yellow Deli. Jesus People USA took over, they started in the 70s. They took over this hotel. They are still there. They still live communally, hundreds of them in this old hotel building. And they're doing just fine.
Where is that?
It's on the north side of Chicago, on Wilson Avenue. And there are a few of the members. Yeah. But they eat communal meals. They have a communal economy. They're still going. Hare Krishnas have had a number of farm communes. There's the Palace of Gold in West Virginia that they built for their founder, but didn't get it done before he died. Some of their housing. Get up at 4 a.m. to have Hindu worship. Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa built the Shambhala Mountains. Well, he didn't really build it. Actually, a group built it, and then they converted into his movement. But they've expanded it a lot since then, built a big Tibetan stupa up there, among other things. It's the inside of the stupa with the big Buddha. Hazrat Khan, the fellow who really brought Sufis to America, his commune, the Abode of the Message, took over an old Shaker barn at an abandoned Shaker village. And I like it that they kept the best known thing about the Shakers going, Chair Factory Road. Anyway, it goes on, and could move on forward, but I've gone way too long, so be interested in questions, comments?
I have a question. One thing that I'm always curious about is I know that, the feminist movement started in the kind of mid-70s, so did most of the communes in the 60s have the women doing most of the indoor labor and child stuff and split out by gender roles?
I think the honest answer is yes. I think that as the women's movement came around, things began to change. I think they went with that pretty well. But I think there kind of wasn't a framework in society for doing it otherwise. That's how people lived. And yeah, I think they did. But in the communes was where a lot of feminine consciousness raising went on. What are we doing? We're making rice and beans, but we're still in the kitchen, by golly. And why is this?
Yeah.
And yet other women to talk to real close at hand. Yeah, dangerous for sure. Yeah?
To show you how the world changes and whatnot, a little bit. Brother Joe and I live between Trinidad and Elmore, about halfway in between. So we got to know these people somewhat and whatnot. And Jim Rodosky and Clark in particular. And after the success and the real energy had left Drop City, I was chairing the Regional Planning Commission here in Trinidad, and we were looking for a draftsman and whatnot to do some work and whatnot, and went through the process, advertising and so on and so forth. And I don't think they were here anymore, actually. I think most of them had gone their own way. But one of the applicants was Clark Ricker, and it worked out. It wasn't that far away from when they used to be out there, so there was a lot of memories and a lot of this and that and whatnot. And we ended up hiring Clark as a draftsman for the Regional Planning Commission and whatnot. And so there was really no repercussions or anything, but it was just the idea that, somebody from down there, planning up here. And And so that was one of them. And then I was administrative vice president of the college, and we were in the process of building a fine arts center, which is just across the street. And the state had a policy that what you did was you had to commit 2% of the appropriations to art. And so this is an art building, performance facility, and so on and so forth. So the state would advertise for you and so on and so forth, and short pool down to you with the top 3 or 4 or 5 candidates and whatnot. And so they went through the process, they did that and whatnot, and Clark was one of the potential selected people and whatnot. And so we went through a process where, what are your visions of what needs to be done, how are we going to represent the arts and so on and so forth. And Clark came up with this thing, and he was a successful artist in this particular case. But hanging on the wall of our building on one side is a panel that I think is probably, this might be a bit of a stretch, but 12 feet wide. 12 feet wide and 6 feet high. No, it may be bigger than that. It's probably 18 feet wide and 9 feet high. And his vision of his artwork would be something like the C major chord, okay? So he took this panel of that size, cut it into 1/4 inch squares, and cut a diagonal into squares, and painted each one of those squares his vision representing the C major chord or whatever it happened to be. So it's hanging over there still.
Is it really?
Yeah.
That big one? That's still there, that's still
Where
there.
is it?
In the
Masari?
Masari
Masari
building on
building.
campus?
Yeah,
I didn't know you
As
did
you walk in
that.
on the right-hand side,
Yeah.
look at that for the state private side.
How do you know?
Yeah.
So drop art remains.
The story that I heard about Drop City, I got here in the 90s, and I heard about Drop City from just local people that said, the school bus that went to Honey passed right by Drop City, and they made the kids put their heads down.
Well, they had a school right across the
Yeah,
road from
across
them.
the street.
I think,
Oh,
I
El
think-
Moro, El
It
Moro.
goes to show though how reality kind of sets in sometimes. You have to make a living as well as this idealistic life that they wanted to do.
well, there might have been another reason why they asked the kids to put their heads down, because when I lived there, we used to sunbathe
That's the reason.
au
They didn't-
natural.
They didn't want the kids to see
Yeah,
naked
so-
ladies and stuff.
And sometimes people would come and stand on El Moro Road with
With binoculars.
with binoculars, like just getting a look at, latter day Adam and Eve's, you know.
So when did you live there?
From May of 1970 until about the first quarter of 73.
Really?
Yeah, then some of us moved into town, and so we had a kind of an in-town little enclave of droppers.
Huh.
And I went to Albuquerque for 2 years and lived there.
We're getting pretty bad by 73, weren't they?
Well, yeah, the thing is, people would come and go, new groups would come. I lived out there by myself for a big part of the summer. And then a whole group just came from Texas. They had heard about it, and they came and they claimed the land for Texas or something. And they set up shop and tried to make it work. Ultimately, I stayed there with them for quite a while. But they had one sort of charismatic leader. Not that he had long hair or beads and bells, and he was just a regular sort of they were ordinarily dressed peoples. But they came out with the intention that they wanted to take it over and make a go of it. But it didn't work out for them ultimately. Yeah.
I never heard that.
Yeah, but it got to the point where those of us who were there in early '73, there were some of us, usually the oldest of the group, would use the big workshop, one of the complex buildings was like we had a giant table in there, and you could do anything in there to make things with your hands. And we tried, hunters used to bring us deer antlers, and we used to make peace pipes out of deer antlers and set them with turquoise stones and beads and bells, and we used to take them up to Denver and sell them to the students up there. And we'd hitchhike. You know, we were able to make a couple of bucks. I mean, how much could you get from a student in 1973? You know. And so it was always like, you know, we always had the wolf at the door, you know, but we managed. I mean, for the 2.5 years, just about that I was there, we did manage. You know, we got food stamps. People would come and bring us food, that kind of thing.
How warm was it in there in the wintertime?
Not warm.
I wondered
No,
about that.
and
No
all those domes,
insulation.
all the domes had a little stove, and some of them were very craftily made by the original founders. And I lived in all of them, except, you know, the big, you know, the movie dome.
Yeah.
And I lived in the complex for a while when I first arrived, but I kind of jumped all over the place and lived in each one. Yeah. Yeah, but it was, you know, we always had wood, and we always had that little wood stove. And so, you know, when you got up in the morning, it's pretty cold. You got up with the bed sheets and things wrapped around you, and then you just start the fire up.
I take exception to your term. I don't think they failed, I think they closed. And yes, the average longevity, that's a project that Tamara and I are working on, actually, to try to look at longevity and statistically figure it out. Everyone says they all are short-lived. Some are, but Shakers have been around since 1774. How short?
Right, that's
Some
what I
of
said,
them
most
get
of them,
those,
it just seems
some
like they're
of them
so
get those
hedonistic.
guru people that are the charismatic center of it, and then when they die or people get disillusioned with that personality, then it all falls apart.
And you can see the legacy continued with the other ones that have
Absolutely.
mirrored and reflected.
Yeah.
There are
which
thousands,
is great.
thousands of them going today. The reason they closed, I don't think there is a reason. I don't think there's any explanation you can point to. There are many. One is, I think, the very simple process that they're typically started by young people. And as a friend of mine who still lives communally, but he says I've seen a lot of people depart, he says some of them decide their children need real shoes. And some of them decide that doing dumpster diving for food really gets old. And
Yeah.
he said, and a few of them realized they
Hard
actually were
work.
Republicans after all.
You know, I watched a documentary by Ina and the hog farm.
The
farm. Oh, the farm.
just
Yeah.
Steve, yeah.
And they had just overwhelming numbers of people that weren't, at first they were good contributors, but then after a while, they just came to party, and
Yeah.
so they had like a core of people that were working their asses off, trying to get food ready and mostly the women, you know, just working like dogs, and they just got tired of it.
That wasn't true at Drop City, because all of us pitched in.
Uh-huh.
It was the younger groups who, you know, were just looking for party life. But the men and the women took turns cooking, you know, serving.
That's
Well,
good.
we always had food.
A
We
lot of
never
the,
went
A lot
hungry.
of the kids that participated in that documentary were real unhappy people about how they were raised, and that really made me sad, because I would think that would be paradise for kids.
Oh, you mean on the farm? with-
Things, or you want to sit and mingle for a little bit and
Say thank you. Thank you.
have a good circuit ride.
Thank you.
Tell us the names of your books so we can go buy them.
Well, this is shameless self-promotion, I suppose. I think
You just happen to have
my
some.
most recent book, one other, if you want to get the information out of it, you can do it.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.